Good evening. Good to see each and every one of you who chose to be with us tonight for our midweek Bible study. If you're visiting, welcome. We're glad you're here. Maybe you're tuning in virtually and you're visiting, maybe even for the first time. Welcome. Glad that you're here. We'll get started, pick up a little bit where we left off last week, do a little bit of review, and we'll hasten right on to the end of the book that we're studying. Those of you who were here last week are laughing. So we are looking at the Song of Solomon. Not because I have any interest necessarily, and let's spend a great deal of time talking about these subject matters, but it was requested, and I put the request off, and it was requested again, and I said, "Are you sure?" And they requested it over and over again, and so I said, "Okay." They did everything but double dog dare me. And so we're in the Song of Solomon. And most of you know that this is a unique book in the Bible. It is a book that deals with some adult topics, and so we've been dealing with those quite cautiously. When we make a kind of rough outline of the book, I think one of the easiest ways to do it is to note that the first part of the book we could call the courtship. And then the middle part of the book we could note the wedding that's mentioned. And then after that we'll have the relationship or the continuing relationship or the marriage. All right, so we talked a little bit last week, and I'm just going to kind of review ever so quickly, get us to where we left off, finish up the book, and then I have some, I guess, practical takeaways that won't deal necessarily with all of the subject matter, but what are some takeaways for us? So we find this courtship that we alluded to. You know, the book starts, as you've read it, you know, it starts very abruptly and it ends very abruptly. We're just thrust right into the middle of these feelings and this relationship and pursuit of the Shunammite and her beloved. And so as we start in chapter 1 and look just immediately as it starts in verse 2, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine." And so we see her desire. And then a pursuit. If we look at verse 7, "Tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon, where you gonna be?" And then verse 8, "If you do not know, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock and feed your little goats beside the shepherd's tents." In other words, where you going to be? I want to be there too. Well, here's where I'm going to be. Come find me. And so we see this mutual pursuit and a mutual attraction that's mentioned on numerous occasions. Also, their mutual feelings, this desire they have for one another, this love and affection that they have for one another is a constant theme. And then we get a little bit about their courting. In chapter 2 and verse 4, for instance, he says, "I'll take you to a banqueting hall." In other words, that's kind of like we would say, "I'll take you out on a date." And so we see some of the particulars of their courtship that's mentioned. Then we talked a little bit about the wedding. If we look at the section that makes up about a chapter and a handful of verses, a chapter and a half or so, it deals with the actual wedding. In verse 11, it talks about the day of the wedding. And much of the vivid description in these poetic terms are the description of Solomon coming in with all of the regal attire and particulars that would be him marching in this procession to be married. And then an extensive description of the bride and all of her beauty follows in chapter 4, verse 1 through 11. That's the section where we noted her description was, you know, her hair is like a flock of goats. I don't know if it does much in today's terms, or to say that her teeth were like sheep who have been washed. You know, in other words, again, these were terms of the day that kind of represented the beauty as he described everything from head to toe, basically. Later he'll describe her feet, but he's going through these descriptions of her teeth and her hair and her eyes. Her eyes are something that he uses a bunch of imagery on numerous occasions to try and describe her beauty. And then there's this section in verse 12 through verse 15 of chapter 4 where there's the discussion of her garden, and she's represented by this garden. A garden, incidentally, that she invites him to take as his own. We see that in chapter 4 in verse 16, where she says, "Let my beloved come to his garden." And then we see the reception of that when we get into the marriage in chapter 5 and verse 1. Then he says, "I have come to my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spices. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk." And so he's talking about feasting upon this formerly, back in chapter 4 and verse 12, sealed garden that is now at his disposal. And so this is the beauty of the consummation of their marriage rites. And so it's being described in poetic terms there. Now, that's where we ended. So there's your roughly 5 minutes of review. If you weren't here last week or if you just needed a reminder. And then we got to verse 2 of chapter 5 under this heading or section, this final section we call the marriage, after the courting and the wedding itself. All right, so look at verse 2. Here's a missed encounter. "I sleep, but my heart is awake. It is the voice of my beloved. He knocks, saying, 'Open for me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is covered with dew, and my locks with the drops of the night.'" And so he's come to pay her a visit in the evening. But here's her response in verse 3, or her reasoning. She says in verse 3, "I have taken off my robe. How can I put it on again? I've washed my feet. How can I defile them?" In other words, I'm already ready for bed. And here he comes to pay a visit. Now, we'll make some points about this in a moment. Verse 4, "My beloved put his hand by the latch of the door, and my heart yearned for him. I arose to open for my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, and my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the lock. I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and was gone. My heart leapt up when he spoke. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer." And so she's going to be in pursuit of him. He's come for a visit, knocked on the door, and she's like, "Well, I've already washed my feet for the night and put on my night clothes." But he had come and come to call for her. And so when she went out to get him, it was too late. And so she says this in verse 8, "I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him I am lovesick." And so we see this phrase again, this swooning, this desire. And then as we drop down to verse 10, there's this interaction between the daughters of Jerusalem. We've mentioned if it were a play, it would have different people representing these parts. And these daughters of Jerusalem represented those who were maidens or virgins, or those who are kind of maybe even looking vicariously through this romance of the Shunammite and the Shulamite rather, and her beloved. And they say to her, "What is your beloved more than another beloved? Or fair among women, what is your beloved more than another beloved, that you so charge us? Why do we have to help you go find him?" And so there's that response. And then she begins to describe him. Now, up to this point, she has only made passing observations about him being handsome and the like. And he's gone out of the way to describe her, and only a few things about him. Now, as we get to verse 10, we see this description. "My beloved is white and ruddy, chief among 10,000. His head is like finest golds. His locks are wavy and black as a raven. His eyes are like doves in the river, by the rivers of water, washed with milk and fitly set. His cheeks are like beds of spices, banks of scented herbs. His lips are lilies dripping liquid myrrh." She goes on to describe his hands, his legs, his mouth, and etc. And so she's describing him in similar ways that she described him. But there's this missed encounter. And then we have these daughters of Jerusalem. Again, if it were a play, this would be another group of individuals speaking. "Where has your beloved gone, O fairest among women? Where is your beloved turned aside, that we may seek him with you?" So there's this missed encounter. He's come to call on her. She says, "Hey, I've already put on my night clothes and washed my feet. How can I come back out again? But I'm lovesick, and so I'll come and I'll answer your call, only to find him missing." And then she doesn't know where to find him. And they say, "Well, why should we help you?" "Oh, he's just great." And then she describes him in all of these terms. And then they say, "Well, where is your beloved?" Now here comes a peculiar part. Here's the answer to that question. Look at verse 2. My beloved has gone to his garden, to the beds of spices, to feed his flock in the gardens, and to gather lilies. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. He feeds his flock among the lilies. So there's two possible ways to interpret this, or there might be 10 possible ways to interpret it, but two of the best are, either she's saying, he's here with me, right? On the surface, that's kind of what it sounds like. The other option that I think might be a good interpretation is, do you remember how he came to her door? Well, why? Why weren't they in the same place? Well, okay, let me drop down to verse 8 of chapter 6. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. I'm not trying to say anything that isn't obvious. He had other options. And so it seems like he came rapping on her door and she wasn't able to catch him in time, and he's found other alternatives. Now, I don't know if that's for certain. And so I said, well, what about these numbers? These numbers don't match. I mean, you have way more concubines and wives listed elsewhere. Well, some have suggested because maybe this was early and she was one of the first of his marriages, and so maybe this is early on. Some of others have suggested these are round numbers to suggest he had other choices. I don't know, and I'm not here to be dogmatic or definitive. But it seems like he came for this visit. She was not readily available. He went elsewhere. I don't know that for certain, but it is interesting that there is reassurance of his love and interest if we drop down to verse 4. Because after the women of Jerusalem say, well, where is your beloved? And she says, well, he's in his garden. In other words, he's satisfying his needs, as was elsewhere described. Okay, drop down. Oh, my love, you are as beautiful as Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners. Turn your eyes away from me, for they have overcome me. Your hair is like a flock of goats going down from Gilead. Your teeth are like the flock of sheep which have come up from the washing. Every one bears twins, and none is barren. That's good if they're sheep, incidentally. In other words, he's saying your teeth are perfect. Nothing wrong with them. And so again, these are similar descriptions we've already seen. And he's still making these descriptions here. And then he mentions that this notion of the other choices, right? There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. Now, but note verse 9. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one. Now, either he's a smooth talker or he loves her. I prefer the latter. All right, so he says, the only one of her mother, the favorite one who bore her, the daughters saw her and called her blessed, the queen and the concubines, and they praised her. You're above them all. Did he have other choices? Yes. I don't know any way around those particulars. I'm not here to defend him. I'm just saying he did. But he reassures her of his love. Tells her that she is unique. We already kind of alluded to that a bit, but if we keep reading. Who is she who looks forth? We're in verse 10. As the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, awesome as an army with banners. And then we see as we drop down to verse, let's note that he has this desire to see her. If we drop down, return, verse 13. Return, return, O Shulamite. Return, return, that we may look upon you. This is the beloved and his friends. And so the idea is that, yes, we had this encounter where we didn't meet, but I want to reassure you of your love and that you're precious to me and you're one that rises above the rest. All right, so that's some about the marriage. Let's keep reading, finish this out. I guess I'll cautiously pause for questions.
What is meant by chapter 5, verse 7? You skipped that one.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, so there's been a variety of suggestions. even suggesting that this is representing a dream, because there are some peculiarities to it. It doesn't seem to flow, and some have suggested that it's not literal happenings, but it's poetic way of describing that she has lost her love. But she's saying in verse 3, can I put my stuff back on and come out? And then she comes out. I arose, but my beloved was gone. And then in verse 7, she's going off into the street. And it says in verse 7, the watchmen who went about the city found me, and they struck me and wounded me. The keepers of the wall took my veil away from me. And so the question is, what does that mean? I don't really know. I really don't. And the suggestions are numerous. And the most common is, this is not to be taken literal. It's probably kind of like a dream that she's weaving in and out of. But I don't know. I have no idea. There are a lot of peculiarities in the book. And some of them, like I mentioned last week, have to do with the fact that poetry is often hard to translate from its original language. And there are some things that we might miss. But the imagery is, if it were a play... Have you ever seen a play and then you understood it, but then there was this one scene, I'm like, I don't know what that was about at all. Am I the only one? Okay, either nobody watches plays or nobody agrees with me. I don't want to say it, but you watch a play and there's this one scene that's kind of peculiar. But in her desire to go find her, she runs off and gets into some trouble. Yeah. Yes, there's time that it seems to be that it's attributed to her going in and out of a dream.
Because chapter 3, verse 3 also says, the watchmen that go about the city found me. She was out looking.
Yeah, I think that's the most common suggestion, is that this may have been what they call a dream motif. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it, to be quite honest. All right, so as we make our way through the book, we find in chapter 7 and the first few verses there, this praise of the beloved, the praise by the beloved. Look at verse 1. And these are similar to some of the other ones we've looked, but additional. How beautiful are your feet in sandals, O prince's daughter. The curves of your thigh are like jewels. The work of your hands is a skillful workman. Your navel is a rounded goblet. It lacks no blended beverage. Your waist is a heap of wheat set about with lilies. Now again, like I mentioned the other time, these are not necessarily pickup lines that you want to use, I don't know if telling a woman today that her waist is like a heap of wheat would be seen as flattering. But they are during this time, and what he's doing is praising her beauty. And it's going from head to toe. It's every curve. It's your hair. It's your teeth. It's your face. It's your smile. He even praises her breath. It's what your breath smells like. It's everything all the way down head to toe. And so he mentions a lot of these particulars. He mentions her breasts again, something we've talked about before. I don't want to talk about again. Your neck is like an ivory tower. Your eyes are like pools in Heshbon by the gates of Bath Rabim. Your nose is like the Tower of Lebanon, which looks towards Damascus. He goes on to describe her head. How fair and pleasant you are, verse 6. And just more descriptions again, mentions her breasts again, and the like. Okay, so he praises her. And this is the marriage portion, incidentally. And then there's this promise of love that she offers. She says in verse 10, I am my beloved's, and his desires toward me. Come, my beloved, let us go forth to the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us get up early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vine is budded, whether the grape blossoms are open and the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. And then we see the power of love. These are the verses we've isolated a few times. I believe arguably they're the heart of the book, the thesis, or the cord that kind of ties all this together is what I refer to often as the power of love, describing its value and its worth. We'll look at them again. But he says in verse 6 of chapter 8, set me as a seal upon your heart and a seal upon your arm. For love is as strong as death, jealousy as cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it. If a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, It would be utterly despised. Nothing you would not give for it. No amount too great. No value ascribed to it. No great. It couldn't be exceeded. It couldn't be destroyed by a flood, burned by a fire. Love can conquer all. And then we see a place of peace as it's described in verse 10 of this chapter. The Shulamite says, I am a wall, and my breasts like towers. Then I become in his eyes as one who found peace. Again, this description of them coming together and it being an episode of peace. But we also see as the book ends, just as abruptly as it started, there's a pursuit. It begins with a pursuit, ends with a pursuit. It's woven into a lot of scenes that are not necessarily linear or chronological. And sometimes there's these dream motifs, and you've got one group speaking and another group speaking. One of the things we never talked about was the brothers. The brothers seem overprotective of her all throughout the book, but I didn't mention those. And there's other things that we could probably pick up on if we wanted to just slow down and get bogged down in all this, but that's not my desire. All right, drop down to verse 11. Solomon had a vineyard at Baal Hamon. He leased the vineyard to keepers. Every one was to bring for its fruit 1,000 silver coins. My own vineyard is before me. You, O Solomon, have made 1,000, and those who tend to the fruit 200. You who dwell in the gardens, the companions, listen for your voice. Let them hear. Make haste, my beloved, and be like the gazelle or the young stag on the mountains of spices. Or, I guess that's kind of like riding off into the sunset in an old Western. I mean, that's the end. What's next? What happens after this? Well, I don't know. It just kind of ends just as abruptly as it started. And so that's the Song of Solomon in a very rudimentary overview of, well, the gist of the book. All right. Any questions before we spend the rest of our time allotted tonight to look at some practical things from the book of Solomon, the Song of Solomon? I wanted to put together some practical lessons that we could learn from this. And what's interesting I think there are several about dating and there's several about marriage. And I thought about my audience, and I don't know how much dating applies to the particular audience. So I'll go through these kind of quickly. But I think I came up with 5 that pertain to dating or courting that could be some, practical lessons we might draw. And then we're going to look at some practical lessons we could draw from this book about marriage or the marriage relationship. There must be mutual attraction. If we go to chapter 1, here are some tips or some practical takeaways, I guess, that we could glean about dating or courting if we were using the Song of Solomon as, a text of that sort. Look at verse 15 and 16. Behold, you are fair, my love. You are fair. And then in return, reciprocating, verse 16. Behold, you are handsome, my beloved. Yes, pleasant. So they both have mutual attraction. I do some counseling, that's relatively formal and then relatively informal. Sometimes people just come to me and ask me my advice. One time, this guy who did not go to church here, incidentally, I had met him independently and I did have a few Bible studies with him and spoke to him about a few things. And he said, I had some other questions. Can I take you out to lunch? And I want to ask you some questions about my relationship with my girlfriend. I said, sure. Free lunch is a free lunch. So we went and ate lunch, and he began to talk to me. And to make a long story short, what he was concerned about was he had had a long history with this young lady who they kind of grew up together as young people and had recently started dating. But he wasn't attracted to her. He was not physically attracted to her. And so he began to say, well, what does that look like? And I said, a lifelong challenge. And so we began to talk, and I gave him some of my thoughts about that, and we discussed it. And I won't tell you all the particulars I told him, but nonetheless, the point was, there needs to be mutual attraction. And that's certainly something that we see from this love story. How difficult would it be to have a spouse you were not attracted to? There must be mutual pursuit. Again, we already alluded to these verses in verse 7. Tell me where you're going to be. And he said, you want to know where I'm going to be? About noon, I'll be over here with my flock. You bring your goats and we'll meet up. The idea was there was this mutual pursuit. If there's not mutual pursuit, what do we call that? Stalking. So the idea there has to be, in this love story, we see mutual attraction, mutual pursuit, mutual interest. We also see that there's attention given to this attractiveness. In part, we see a repetitive theme of the idea that you gave attention to some basic things. Look at verse 3. Because of the fragrance of your good ointments. All right, let me see. Look around the room. I don't see any teenagers. Let's make fun of them for just a second. I don't know if you know this, but teenagers, the most of them have a smell. All right, some of y'all have teenagers, right? You have to remind them, you need to take a shower, you need to put on deodorant, you need to pay attention to your feet stink, your breath stinks. I mean, you need to do some. I mean, some of you parents, some of you are looking like, oh, I can't believe you said that. And then others are like, mm-hmm. But the idea is he's saying, these are things that were attractive, or, I mean, even basic hygiene. But beyond basic hygiene, there's some other things that are far more important that we give attention to. In the same verse, he says, your name is ointment poured forth. The thing that we see in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1 is that a good name is better than precious ointment. Now, what's the best thing you can do to be attractive to someone you want to attract? Integrity? Well, smell good. Yeah. But more important than that, a good reputation, integrity, uprightness. I mean, why in the world, in the context of our discussion here, would you want to seek someone who didn't have a good name? Right? And so these are ways that we make ourselves, attractive, viable. And so we see that among other things that we might could learn. Here's one that seems to be a perpetual theme. Be careful and be patient. Let's look at these verses ever so quickly. In fact, I've been doing all the talking. Let's get some volunteers. Will somebody read chapter 2 and verse 7? All right, chapter 3 and verse 5. We'll find something almost verbatim. Who will read that for us?
I assure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you will not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases.
One more, chapter 8, verse 4. What's the problem with stirring up or waking up or provoking or arousing these desires? What's the problematic concern? Yeah, there's no avenue or option outside of marriage for you to engage in those things. So be very cautious, be very careful, be very patient. Make your mind up long before you start fogging up the windows as to what you're going to do. Is this making sense? So this is advice for dating, right? He's saying, be careful that you awake. These are powerful feelings. This love that is also not just, a phileo love or a love that is, generic, but this is love that includes an erotic love for a married couple. Don't start arousing that prematurely. Be careful and be patient. And take note that your support system will rejoice. In chapter 1 and verse 4, it says, we will be glad and rejoice. If you're dating and your main supporters aren't able to gladly rejoice for the one that you're courting, that should be a red flag. All right, so those are a few quick tips, a few things that we might could think of about courting that we could draw. But most of the application I'll draw, the remainder of it for tonight, will deal with marriage. Are there any questions about those things before we move on? Sex in marriage is to be celebrated. There's fact number one. I think we all know Hebrews 13 and verse 4, at least if I got you started, you'd remember it. Marriage is honorable, and the bed undefiled. Now he goes on to say that the fornicator and the adulterer will be judged by God. That's wrong, right? That's why you need to be careful and patient about stirring up that arousal and that love before it's time to be enjoyed. But there's nothing wrong with sex in marriage. It's God's design. And I think that there's, I think people ask me, why do you think, in fact, just this evening, why do you think Song of Solomon is even in the Bible? So I'm not entirely sure, but I'm sure it's in there. I'm not entirely sure, but if there was just this one point that we got away from it, that we shouldn't feel shame or guilt about enjoying an intimate, a fruitful, intimate, sexual relationship with our partner, that's enough to have it in there. Amen. But sex is to be celebrated within the confines of marriage. It's not something to be shamed or looked at as something taboo or wrong. We also can learn from this that we have the obligation, being married, to render the affection that is necessary and due to our partner. Will somebody read for us 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 3? We read this section last time, where we talked about how your body is not your own, but your body belongs to your spouse and vice versa, and we looked at those verses. But there's an interesting phrase in verse 3. Will somebody read 1 Corinthians 7:3?
The husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband.
Now, I appreciate wholeheartedly that within the context, it's talking about sexual intimacy. In fact, just go to verse 1, read the whole section. In the context, it's talking about sexual intimacy. However, this particular word that's rendered affection is not a word that's associated with sexual intimacy at all. In fact, it's a word that has the idea of goodwill, benevolence, kindness, or even the word favor. So when we say, okay, let me ask the question like this. I do this in marriage counseling all the time because it works out real well, in that setting. But I say, when it says that you have to render to your wife the affection due her, and the wife has to render the affection due you to you, are those the same things? Is the affection that she longs for, desires, and needs the same as the affection you long for, desire, and need? Not necessarily. But the idea is that affection or benevolence or kindness or favor that you show is received different based upon men and women. And it's individualized to some degree, right? Are you familiar with the 5 love languages? His needs, her needs. I go through both those books every time I do marriage counseling with somebody. I don't go through the book in its entirety. I usually fast forward to the end, get to the survey part, let them fill out the survey, and then we discuss it. And what's interesting is they've usually never done that before. And they're usually surprised to even discover their own love language, much less their partner's. Or to have a fruitful discussion about needs. There's affection that your spouse needs and desires, and she is designed to get it exclusively from you, and vice versa. And so we have this obligation to provide those. I'm not endorsing the book necessarily. There are things in it I agree with and find virtuous and things I don't, but the book His Needs, Her Needs, the subtitle is How to Build an Affair-Proof Marriage. And the reason is, in the premise of the book, in the first chapter, I think, it might be in the preface of the book, the point that he makes is, your spouse has needs that you're designed to give them. And if you don't give them, what will they do? Oftentimes go outside the marriage to get that from someone else. And those things are not just sexual intimacy. They include these things that we might put in the category of affection. See, we see a lot of things that are, I guess for lack of a better term, leading up to their physical intimacy, that are doing what? Building the flame of this love. All right. Questions about that? That makes sense. You need to praise your spouse. I mean, if you didn't read that and see praise just all through the book, they're just praising each other back and forth. Listen, before and after the marriage, when they were dating and when they were married too. All right, I know you probably know the verse, but will somebody read Proverbs 31, verse 28 for us? Out loud.
Her children rise up and bless her, her husband also, and he praises her, saying,
He praises her. And we could just as clearly say, she ought to praise him. We see that all throughout this book. We're called by Solomon on another occasion in the Proverbs to be satisfied with the wife of our youth. In a physical intimacy setting sense. But does that mean she's still young? Oh, no, not necessarily. And vice versa. And so we still have this obligation to praise one another. I mean, that's part of the affection that's necessary and rendered and due. Proverbs 18, verse 21 says, life and death are in the power of the tongue. Well, the life and death of a marriage are in the power of a tongue too. You can put the death nail in a marriage by the things that come off your tongue. And you can breathe life into your marriage by the things that come off your tongue too. Next, keeping your first love. You know, I don't know how much time passed in the context of this love poem, the Song of Solomon. I don't know. But there is a persistent and pervasive love. You know, we're told of those who have left their first love. My favorite verse to just cross-reference with that passage in Revelation every time is Jeremiah 2:2. Will somebody quickly read Jeremiah 2:2 for us?
Go and cry in the hearing of Jerusalem, saying, Thus says the Lord, I remembered you, the kindness of your youth, the love of your
Betrothal.
when you went after me in the wilderness, in a land not sown.
Here is God lamenting their first love. He's lamenting a memory. I remember when you pursued me. I remember the love we had when we were engaged. I remember that love. Now what he was saying is, I don't have that love from you anymore. You're not pursuing me anymore. You don't care about me anymore. You've put me on the back burner. We don't have that love anymore. That's why I do marriage counseling. 8 times out of 10, that love ain't there no more. And that's why they come to me. That's why, nobody comes to me with marriage counseling and says, we just want to brush up on some stuff. We're doing real good. But life has gotten in the way. And those feelings have waned. All that has to be fostered. It doesn't happen without effort. Look at the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. Here's some tips, some practical observations, some practical lessons we might learn from the Song of Solomon as it pertains to marriage. And one of those is weather the storms. Look at chapter 2. For lo, the winter is past, and the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth, and the time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. And he goes on to describe the spring. Look, this is the truth. Your marriage will have seasons to it. I mean, there'll be times where it feels like winter. I mean, all it is domestic responsibility, kid raising, frustration, arguments. It just has its difficulties. Might be a winter season. That winter season might include other things. It might be grief or physical ailments or financial burdens. I don't know what they might be. Job layoff. Anything that can affect your marriage in a negative way can be a season. What comes after every winter? Spring. And so the idea is that you're going to have ups and downs, valleys and peaks. I mean, if anybody thinks that marriage is like like this, no, it's more like this. It's like a stock market. It's going to go up and down and up and down and up and down. But ideally, it's going to keep progressing up and to the right over time. But the idea is there's going to be peaks and valleys. There's going to be seasons. Survive the seasons. All right, we just got a few more, but we're going to probably run out of time. You need the reassurance of exclusivity. That's a fancy way of saying you need to reassure the other one you're in this for the long haul and that you're the only one for me. And that seems to be, even in the context, listen to me, even in the context of a very culturally different marriage situation, with all the concubines and wives and the polygamy and all that going on, there was still an effort made on the part of Solomon to give reassurance of an exclusive love. I don't know if he did that for all of them. You know, the Bible says interestingly enough, it was the love of these women that took him away from God, but did he love them all? I don't know. To what degree? I don't know. Was he this passionate with all of them? Did he tell them all the same thing? I don't have the foggiest clue. But I know that he reassured her that she was the only one for him, even in the context of that polygamous situation he was in. All right, we'll have to pick up here, finish out this list of some practical observation, hasten on through this and be done with the Song of Solomon and start something a whole lot less awkward, I guess. All right, I appreciate your attention.